The penthouse windows reflected a freezing Chicago skyline. It was our wedding night. Cameron loosened his tie, his expression completely hollow. Starting tonight, my intern, Grace, will be sharing this bed. He stated, "This marriage is just a real estate transaction." He expected tears. He expected me to shatter. Instead, I smiled, pulled out my phone, and dialed my wealth manager. "Freeze the $2.5 billion escrow account. Yes, all of it." Cameron stopped breathing. "If you've ever had to keep your composure while your heart shattered, tell me where and what time you're listening to this." The silence in the penthouse was heavier than the Chicago winter outside. Cameron stood frozen by the edge of the master bed, his hand still hovering near his collar. He had calculated every variable of this merger, except my reaction. I did not drop my phone. I did not demand an explanation about his intern. I simply tapped the end call button and slid the device back into my silver evening clutch. "You cannot do that," Cameron finally said, his voice losing its rehearsed monotone. "The board requires those funds cleared by Monday morning. If the $2.5 billion is locked in escrow, the entire Gold Coast acquisition falls apart." I smoothed the lace of my custom bridal gown. The fabric felt absurdly heavy now, a theatrical costume for a play that had just been cancelled. "I just did," I replied. My voice was perfectly level. I did not raise it by a single decibel. "When we signed the prenuptial agreement, there was a strict morality clause. You chose to void it before midnight. The funds are legally suspended pending a full breach of contract investigation." I walked toward the heavy oak double doors of the suite. My heels clicked against the imported Italian marble, echoing like the ticking of a metronome. Each step was a deliberate choice to walk away from a future I thought I understood. I had entered this marriage to consolidate our real estate empires, to build a fortress of capital that could protect my family. I had expected a corporate partnership, perhaps even mutual respect. I had not expected an insult delivered with such calculated cruelty. "Lauren," Cameron called out. I stopped, but I did not turn around to look at him. "This is for the best. You need to leave." His words were strange. There was no malice in them, only a hollow sort of finality. But I had no room for curiosity tonight. My entire empire was suddenly at risk, and my priority was asset protection. I reached for the brass handle, the cool metal grounding my racing thoughts. I stepped out into the corridor and walked into the private elevator. The descent from the penthouse to the lobby felt like falling through a void. When I reached the ground floor, the night concierge looked startled to see the bride leaving alone, but my expression dared him to ask. I stepped out into the crisp night air and signaled for a town car. I gave the driver the address to my own apartment. I did not shed a tear. The engine roared to life. I arrived at my architecture firm exactly at 8 in the morning. I had traded the white lace for a charcoal-tailored suit, my armor for the day. The news of the frozen $2.5 billion had already hit the financial wires. The firm's lobby was buzzing with hushed whispers, but the moment I stepped through the glass doors, the chatter vanished. I walked straight to my corner office, my posture completely upright. My desk was covered in intricate architectural models of the new Civic Center, a project I had won through sheer merit. I was pouring myself a cup of black coffee when the door swung open. Logan walked in, bypassing my assistant entirely. Logan was a top-tier mergers and acquisitions specialist, fiercely intelligent, and a man who had made his romantic interests in me known for the past 3 years. I had chosen Cameron's corporate stability over Logan's relentless pursuit. "I heard the market waking up to an earthquake," Logan said, leaning against the doorframe. He was holding a fresh folder of financial printouts. "A massive freeze on the Davenport merger. The street is panicking." "The street will survive," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. And so will I. Logan walked over and dropped the folder on my desk. I am not here to say I told you so. I am here to offer my team. We can dissect Cameron's entire portfolio by noon. If he breached the contract, we can tear his holdings apart. You do not have to fight this alone. I looked at Logan. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but underlined with genuine concern. He was offering me a weapon. But bringing Logan in meant handing over control, and I was done relinquishing control to anyone. I placed my coffee cup down with a soft click. I appreciate the offer, Logan, I said, my tone remaining strictly professional. But this is my capital, and this is my contract. I will handle Cameron and his board on my own terms. I do not need a savior. He studied my face for a long moment, searching for a crack in my composure. He found none. Logan nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk. Fair enough. But if you need a financial firing squad, you know my number. When he left the office, I turned my attention back to the architectural models. Buildings made sense. They had foundations, load-bearing walls, and predictable physics. People were messy, but I had spent my entire life designing structures that could withstand hurricanes. I could certainly design a legal strategy to dismantle a man who thought he could humiliate me. I pulled up the escrow documentation on my monitor. The war had begun. At noon, I left the firm and drove toward the private medical wing of the city hospital. Mia, my 14-year-old sister, was scheduled for her routine treatments. She was born with a rare autoimmune condition, rendering her fragile and entirely dependent on the Sterling family's medical trust. Walking into her room always required leaving the corporate architect at the door. Mia was sketching in her notebook when I arrived. She smiled, her pale face lighting up. We talked about art, about her nurses, about anything other than the disaster of my wedding night. She did not need that burden. I stayed for an hour, ensuring her primary physician confirmed the trust payments were actively clearing. Gregory, my uncle, was the sole executor of that medical fund. It was the one piece of leverage he still held over me. After kissing Mia goodbye, I stopped at a quiet corner cafe near the hospital district to review some emails. I sat by the window, the rain beginning to mist the glass. That was when I saw her. Grace, the intern, the woman Cameron claimed was sleeping in his bed. She was sitting 2 tables away, completely unaware of my presence. She did not look like a mistress reveling in a billionaire's penthouse. She was wearing a faded trench coat, her hair tied back messily. More importantly, she was entirely engrossed in a stack of heavy financial ledgers. I watched her trace lines of data with a highlighter. My architectural eye caught the headers on the documents she was spreading across the table. They were not Cameron's corporate filings. They were shell company registrations. I recognized the formatting. They were the exact same shell structures Gregory used for his offshore construction contracts. Why was Cameron's supposed lover investigating my uncle's financial ghosts? The narrative Cameron had spun last night suddenly showed a massive structural flaw. Grace looked exhausted, driven by a frantic sort of desperation as she cross-referenced tax identification numbers. Watching her, a deeply buried memory surfaced in my mind. Years ago, shortly before my father passed away, he had shown me an original blueprint of our historic family estate in the country. He had pointed to a specific coordinate in the library, a load-bearing pillar that did not match the aesthetic symmetry of the room. Architects always leave a hidden space for the truth. Lauren, he had whispered. I had forgotten that moment entirely until now. Cameron's lie, Grace's investigation, and Gregory's tight grip on Mia's trust fund were not isolated events. They were intersecting lines on a much larger blueprint. I took a photo of Grace from my table, capturing the documents in front of her. I needed to know what she was looking for. I paid my bill and walked out. Sitting in the back of my town car, I looked down at the faint, jagged scar running along my lower abdomen. The sight of it pulled me back to a memory I rarely allowed myself to visit. It is the most effective trap in the world when the villain hands you a bandage after orchestrating the wound. 9 years ago, I was inspecting one of our firm's newest high-rise developments. Gregory was the lead project manager at the time. I remember the sudden, terrifying sound of snapping metal. A massive section of the primary scaffolding collapsed directly above me. I woke up 3 days later in a sterile white hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of machines acting as the soundtrack to my new reality. The surgeon stood at the foot of my bed, his expression grave. The internal trauma had been catastrophic. I had survived, but I would never be able to carry a child. The physical damage was permanent. When the doctor left, Gregory walked into the room. He looked devastated, his eyes red and his shoulders slumped. He sat beside my bed, holding my hand, promising that he would take care of everything. He paid the exorbitant medical bills. He handled the insurance settlements. He seamlessly took over the executive duties of the company while I was incapacitated. When our father passed away shortly after, Gregory smoothly transitioned into the role of the family's protector, taking sole control of Mia's newly formed medical trust. This is the psychological normalization of abuse. Gregory did not present himself as a threat. He presented himself as a savior. I was a grieving daughter, physically traumatized and terrified for my little sister's health. I allowed him to build a cage around us because he painted the bars gold. For years, I accepted his unsolicited advice on my projects, his constant auditing of my personal accounts, and his tight-fisted control over Mia's healthcare payouts. I mistook his absolute control for familial duty. But the structural integrity of his lies was degrading. Looking at the photo of Grace studying his shell companies, the pieces shifted. The scaffolding collapse 9 years ago had never felt right to me. The safety reports Gregory submitted had blamed a faulty weather anomaly, but I had designed that rig myself. It was built to withstand a Category 3 storm. Gregory had crippled me, stolen my inheritance, and made me thank him for the privilege. He had weaponized my gratitude to keep me compliant. My fingers tightened around my phone. The grief I had carried for 9 years slowly crystallized into a cold, methodical rage. I was no longer the broken girl in the hospital bed. I spent the years following the accident rebuilding myself from the ground up, while Gregory took control of the family's assets and Mia's medical trust. I focused entirely on the one thing he could not manage: my mind. Architecture was my sanctuary. A building is honest. If the foundation is weak, the structure will inevitably fall. If the mathematics are correct, it will stand for centuries. I preferred the absolute certainty of steel and concrete over the shifting sands of human loyalty. My father had taught me that, before he passed away, he would bring me to his construction sites, explaining how the visible beauty of a skyscraper was entirely dependent on the invisible framework hidden within its walls. He was the only person who truly understood me, the only one who saw my potential as a creator rather than just a passive heiress. When he died, that profound sense of safety vanished, replaced by Gregory's suffocating oversight. Gregory constantly suggested I take a step back from the demanding hours of the firm. He offered me ceremonial board positions, roles focused on public relations and philanthropy. He wanted me to be a smiling face for the Sterling Empire, a decorative ornament with no real operational power. He claimed it was for my health, reminding me gently of my physical limitations after the scaffolding collapse. I politely declined every single offer. I did not want to cut ribbons. I wanted to draft blueprints. I started at the bottom of our own firm, working under an assumed name for external competitions. I spent countless nights analyzing stress loads, material tensile strengths, and urban zoning regulations. The scent of drafting paper and cold coffee became my absolute comfort. I learned to mask my physical discomfort during long site visits, projecting an aura of complete, unshakable competence. When I won the bid for the city's new civic center, it was through a blind submission process. The selection committee did not know I was a Sterling until the contract was already awarded. Gregory had been visibly surprised at the press conference, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He realized then that I had built my own reputation, entirely independent of the trust funds he controlled. I had constructed a professional fortress that he could not easily dismantle. Every line I drew on a blueprint was a quiet rebellion against the narrative Gregory had written for me. He wanted me dependent. He needed me to feel fragile. But the more I immersed myself in the rigorous logic of architectural engineering, the clearer my vision became. I began to understand how structures failed, and I slowly started applying that same analytical lens to the people around me. The success of the Civic Center project gave me the leverage I needed to become the firm's chief architect. It was a title earned through relentless precision. I built my own foundation. The society galas in Chicago were always an exercise in endurance. I would attend these lavish events wearing custom silk gowns, projecting the image of the perfect, successful heiress. But beneath the expensive fabric lay a truth that the elite circles whispered about over their champagne glasses. The internal injuries from the accident 9 years ago were permanent. The surgeons had been very clear. The physical space where a child should grow had been irreparably damaged. I remember the initial profound emptiness that followed that diagnosis. It was not just a physical void, it was a societal marker. In the circles my family operated within, an heiress who could not produce a direct biological heir was quietly viewed as a depreciating asset. I could see the pity in the eyes of distant relatives and family friends. They looked at me as a tragedy, a broken branch on the Sterling family tree. For a brief period, that invisible chain of victimhood weighed heavily on my shoulders. I allowed their silent judgments to dictate my self-worth. But grief is an inefficient use of energy, and I had no time to waste on self-pity. I looked at my younger sister, Mia. Her immune system was failing her, keeping her isolated in sterile rooms and endless medical consultations. She was incredibly vulnerable, entirely at the mercy of a trust fund that I now realized was managed by a man I could not fully trust. The moment I understood the depth of her vulnerability, the void inside me shifted. I redirected every ounce of maternal instinct I possessed into a singular, unyielding purpose. I would become her absolute protector. I might not be able to carry a child, but I could certainly carry the weight of my sister's future. I began auditing her medical invoices myself. I vetted her specialists. I ensured that her daily environment was perfectly optimized for her recovery. I transformed my quiet grief into a cold, protective armor. Gregory noticed the shift. He tried to brush off my inquiries into Mia's care, citing complex administrative protocols and his fiduciary duty. I simply smiled, quoted the exact medical statutes back to him, and demanded the ledgers. The pity of the high society matrons no longer mattered to me. Their whispers were completely irrelevant. My worth was not defined by my biology, but by my capacity to shield the innocent from the calculated greed of the powerful. Mia was not just my sister. She was my absolute priority. She was my red line. Sitting in my office, looking at the image of Grace poring over those shell company documents, the architecture of my recent marriage finally snapped into sharp focus. My union with Cameron was never rooted in romance. It was a highly calculated financial maneuver. Cameron was the CEO of our largest competitor. For years, our two corporations had engaged in a fierce bidding war over prime real estate in the Gold Coast district. We owned adjacent lots, each too small to independently support the mega development the city was demanding. Merging the properties was the only logical solution, but a standard joint venture was legally fragile. A corporate marriage, tightly bound by a bulletproof prenuptial agreement, provided the absolute financial stability required to secure the massive $2.5 billion investment from the international banking syndicate. More importantly, it provided me with liquid capital. My primary objective in agreeing to the merger was to secure enough independent wealth to establish a completely new, private medical trust for Mia, a trust that I would control directly, completely bypassing Gregory and the restrictive clauses of the original family estate. I needed to extract Mia from his financial grasp, and Cameron's corporate machinery offered the perfect exit strategy. We had negotiated the terms of our marriage in a glass boardroom, flanked by rows of corporate attorneys. Cameron had been ruthlessly pragmatic. He reviewed the morality clauses, the asset division protocols, and the public relations timeline with the efficiency of a machine. He agreed to every stipulation. We shook hands on a multi-billion-dollar alliance designed to protect both our empires. It was an impeccable equation. I had meticulously planned every variable. I anticipated the media scrutiny, the exhaustive board meetings, and the sheer exhaustion of faking a high-profile relationship. I was fully prepared to honor my side of the contract for the required 5-year term. I had designed a flawless structure to save my sister. But Cameron had breached the core morality clause before midnight on our wedding day. By declaring his intent to sleep with his intern, he triggered the immediate freeze of the escrow account. The international funds were locked. The Gold Coast acquisition was stalled, and my meticulously crafted exit strategy for Mia was suddenly trapped in a legal vacuum. The equation was completely shattered. The intercom on my desk buzzed lightly. My assistant informed me that Gregory had arrived and was demanding immediate entry. I minimized the window displaying the photo of Grace, straightened the cuffs of my jacket, and instructed her to send him in. Gregory walked into my office wearing a tailored navy suit, his silver hair perfectly combed. He projected the warm, paternal authority he had carefully cultivated over the past 9 years. He did not sit in the guest chairs opposite my desk. Instead, he paced slowly toward the panoramic window, looking out over the city skyline before turning to face me. "Lauren, my dear," he began, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "I heard the news about last night. I am deeply sorry. Cameron is a fool." "Thank you, Gregory," I replied, my tone neutral. "I am handling the situation. Are you—" He sighed heavily, leaning against the edge of my drafting table. "Freezing the $2.5 billion escrow account is a rather drastic measure. The market is highly volatile today. The board is incredibly anxious. They are looking to me for reassurance. The board will be provided with a full legal briefing by the end of the day," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. "The contract was breached. The freeze is a standard protective protocol." Gregory's smile tightened slightly at the corners. The mask of the benevolent uncle was slipping, just a fraction of an inch. "I understand you are emotional, Lauren, but we must consider the broader implications. Your father's estate is heavily leveraged against the success of this merger. If the liquidity is trapped in escrow, the yields on our internal investments will drop significantly." He paused, letting the silence stretch out, ensuring his next words landed exactly where he intended. "I would hate for that financial instability to impact the specialized immunological therapies Mia is scheduled to receive next month. Those treatments are extraordinarily expensive. It was a brilliant maneuver, a threat elegantly cloaked in bureaucratic concern. He was using my sister's failing health as leverage to force me to unfreeze the multi-billion-dollar account. He needed that money flowing immediately. I kept my breathing perfectly even. I did not glare. I did not raise my voice to defend my sister. I simply looked at him, analyzing his posture, the slight tension in his jaw, the urgency hidden behind his calm facade. Why was the chief financial officer so desperate for an external capital injection? The pieces aligned instantly. I saw right through him. Mia's medical treatments are non-negotiable. Gregory, I stated. My voice was as smooth and cold as polished glass. The family trust holds sufficient liquid reserves to cover her care for the next decade. The escrow freeze on the Gold Coast merger has absolutely zero legal bearing on her medical disbursements. Gregory's eyes narrowed. He realized his emotional leverage had failed to land. Liquidity can be a complex issue. Lauren, I am simply advising caution. Unfreeze the account, let the merger proceed, and deal with Cameron's indiscretions privately. Do not let your pride ruin our empire. My pride is not the issue, I said, standing up from my chair. My legal obligation to protect my assets is now. If you will excuse me, I have a building to design. He stared at me for a long, tense moment before nodding sharply. Do not make a mistake you cannot afford. Lauren. He turned and walked out, closing the door firmly behind him. The moment the lock clicked, a side door connecting to the private conference room opened. Logan walked in. He had been listening to the entire exchange. He did not say a word about Gregory's thinly veiled threats. Instead, he walked over to my desk and opened the heavy financial folder he had brought in earlier that morning. You were right to freeze the funds, Logan said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual playful arrogance. He pointed to a series of highlighted spreadsheets. My team ran a deep forensic sweep on the Sterling portfolio while you were at the hospital. Gregory is bleeding your family's accounts dry. I looked down at the data. It was complex, heavily obscured by layers of international corporate jargon. But the architecture of the fraud was clear. He has been funneling massive amounts of capital from the primary trust into a network of offshore shell companies. Logan continued, tracing the money trail with his pen. He lists them as anonymous subcontractors for your development projects. The money goes out to pay for materials that never arrive, and it vanishes. The entire Sterling Trust is a hollow shell. He is operating on a massive deficit. The realization hit me with absolute clarity. Gregory had pushed so aggressively for my marriage to Cameron because he desperately needed the $2.5 billion capital injection from the merger. He intended to use the influx of external corporate funds to quietly plug the massive financial black hole he had created before the federal auditors noticed. My marriage was not just a real estate strategy. It was a bailout for a thief. The numbers never lie. I did not return to the office that afternoon. Instead, I parked my car in the subterranean garage beneath the apartment building where Grace resided. I had instructed my security team to run a quiet background check on her residency. The concrete pillars and dim fluorescent lights created an atmosphere of complete isolation. I waited in the driver's seat for exactly 45 minutes. When Grace finally walked out of the elevator bay, she looked exhausted. She was carrying a heavy leather tote bag, the same one I had seen her with at the cafe. I stepped out of my car, blocking her path to the exit. My posture was completely relaxed, but my presence was intentional. Grace stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened in absolute terror as she recognized the woman whose wedding night she had supposedly ruined. She took a step back, her grip tightening on her heavy bag. Lauren, Grace whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Please, I can explain. You do not need to explain the affair, I said, my voice maintaining a perfectly even cadence. I pulled a printed photograph from my tailored pocket and handed it to her. It was the picture I had taken at the cafe, clearly showing the shell company tax identification numbers. You need to explain why my husband's supposed mistress is running a forensic audit on Gregory Sterling's offshore construction accounts. Grace stared at the photograph, the color completely drained from her face. The heavy leather tote bag slipped from her shoulder, hitting the concrete floor with a dull thud. A few files spilled out, revealing more highlighted financial spreadsheets. She did not try to pick them up. Instead, the young woman simply covered her face with her hands and began to cry. It was not the theatrical crying of a guilty lover caught in a lie. It was the sheer relief of a person collapsing under an unbearable weight. I am not his mistress, Grace sobbed, her words muffled behind her trembling hands. I have never touched Cameron. I swear to you. I did not move closer to comfort her. I remained completely still, processing the geometric shift of the narrative. Then what exactly are you doing in his penthouse? Grace? She wiped her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I am his sister. His half-sister. The words hung in the cold air of the parking garage. The architectural integrity of Gregory's lies was finally beginning to buckle. Grace explained everything in rapid, fragmented sentences. Her mother had been an independent contractor, entirely ruined by one of Gregory's fraudulent development schemes 10 years ago. When Cameron discovered Grace's existence a few years ago, he brought her into his corporate fold under the guise of an internship. He positioned her there to safely and quietly track the stolen funds flowing through Gregory's network, ensuring she remained entirely off the Sterling family's radar. Cameron staged the affair, Grace said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He wanted you to freeze the $2.5 billion immediately. He needed an ironclad, legally indisputable reason for you to lock that money away from Gregory without alerting your uncle to the actual audit. I looked down at the scattered financial files on the concrete floor. The freezing of the escrow account was not a reaction to a broken heart. It was the exact security protocol my husband had manipulated me into executing. He had orchestrated his own villainy to build a financial fortress around me. The puzzle finally locked together. I drove directly to Cameron's corporate headquarters. The receptionist tried to stop me, citing his strict privacy protocols, but I simply walked past her desk and pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of his executive suite. The room was expansive, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray waters of Lake Michigan. Cameron was standing by the window. He did not look like the ruthless corporate titan who had dismissed me on our wedding night. He looked entirely hollowed out, leaning heavily against the glass pane for physical support. When he turned to face me, the cold facade he had worn for the past 48 hours had completely vanished. His eyes reflected a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Grace told me, I said, my voice steady, cutting through the silence of the massive room. I know about the shell companies. I know she is your sister. I know the affair was a calculated performance. Cameron closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting out a long, ragged exhale. He walked slowly toward his desk, his movements unusually stiff. He opened a locked drawer and pulled out a thick medical file, sliding it across the polished wood toward me. I did not need to read every page to understand the gravity of the medical terminology. Severe genetic cardiomyopathy, Cameron stated, his voice a low monotone. My heart is failing. The degeneration accelerated rapidly over the last 3 months. I am scheduled for a high-risk transplant surgery next week. The survival statistics are not in my favor. I stared at the medical documentation. The neat, printed letters outlined a death sentence. I knew Gregory was bleeding your family's trust dry. Cameron continued, his gaze fixed on the medical file. I knew he was desperately relying on our merger's $2.5 billion capital injection to cover his fraudulent deficit before the federal auditors arrived. If I died during the surgery, and you were legally bound to me in a standard marriage, Gregory would have manipulated the board and accessed that liquidity. He would have destroyed your entire empire and left Mia with absolutely nothing. He looked up, meeting my eyes with a heartbreaking clarity. I needed the escrow account completely frozen. I needed the funds legally untouchable by any board member, including Gregory. But if I told you the truth about my heart, you would have stayed to fight alongside me. Gregory would have seen us preparing, and he would have found a back door. Cameron had calculated every emotional response. So, I gave you the one thing that would make you ruthlessly and instantly lock down the capital without hesitation. I gave you a profound betrayal. I knew your pride and your intelligence would force you to freeze the assets to protect yourself. He paused, his hands resting flat on the desk. I wanted you rich, safe, and entirely free of my sinking ship. He chose to die hated. Cameron waited in the quiet executive suite, bracing himself for my reaction. He had drafted the perfect tragedy. He anticipated either an outburst of devastating tears or a profound expression of tragic gratitude. He had meticulously designed a scenario where I was the fragile asset to be protected, safely removed from the blast radius of his impending death. I offered him neither tears nor gratitude. I picked up the heavy medical file from the polished mahogany desk. Then, I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out the expedited divorce agreement his legal team had couriered to my office that very morning. The contract was pristine, demanding my signature to finalize the separation and permanently lock the frozen funds in my sole possession. I held the divorce papers in both hands. With a slow, deliberate motion, I tore the thick document perfectly in half. The sound of ripping paper was shockingly loud in the silent room. I placed the torn pieces neatly on top of his medical file. You are an exceptional chief executive officer, Cameron, I said, my voice maintaining a dangerously calm frequency. Your risk management protocols are flawless, but you are a terrible architect. Cameron stared at the torn papers, his composure finally fracturing. Lauren, you cannot stay. You need to distance yourself from the medical liability and the board fallout. I designed this exit specifically for your survival. You do not get to design my survival, I replied, taking a step closer to his desk. And you absolutely do not get to manage my grief. You decided, in your boundless arrogance, that I was too fragile to handle the reality of a failing heart. You decided that my capacity to love was weaker than my capacity to hate. You built a foundation based entirely on a lie because you were terrified of leaning on someone else. I looked directly into his exhausted eyes. The anger I felt was not fiery, it was a cold, absolute certainty. I have spent the last 9 years navigating a life built on Gregory's fraudulent benevolence. I will not spend the next 50 years living in a safe, gilded cage constructed from your noble martyrdom. I married a partner, not a martyr. Cameron opened his mouth to argue, but I raised a single hand, stopping him instantly. The $2.5 billion remains frozen, I commanded softly. That capital is our leverage. Grace will continue her forensic audit with Logan's team. You will go to your surgical consultations, and I will sit in the waiting room. We are going to dismantle Gregory's empire, and then we are going to fix your heart. Do not ever attempt to write my narrative for me again. He looked at me, realizing the sheer, unbreakable density of my resolve. He slowly nodded. I choose where I stand. Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of an executioner. The corporate headquarters of the Sterling firm was suffocating under a thick blanket of manufactured tension. Gregory had officially called an emergency meeting of the board of directors. The agenda was distributed at dawn, and its contents were entirely predictable. He was initiating a hostile internal coup. I walked into the glass-walled boardroom precisely on time. The space was filled with 20 of the most powerful shareholders in Chicago. They sat in heavy leather chairs, their expressions a mix of calculated neutrality and quiet apprehension. Gregory sat at the head of the table, his posture radiating a somber, paternal concern that made my stomach turn. "Thank you all for convening on such short notice," Gregory began, his voice echoing in the acoustically perfect room. He looked at me with a perfectly crafted expression of sorrow. "We are facing an unprecedented crisis. As you are aware, Lauren has unilaterally frozen the $2.5 billion escrow account tied to our most critical merger. This impulsive action has effectively stalled our quarterly growth projections." He activated the central monitor, projecting a series of carefully manipulated financial charts showing a sudden dip in liquidity. "Furthermore," Gregory continued, lowering his voice to a compassionate murmur, "I have serious concerns regarding Lauren's emotional stability. The sudden collapse of her marriage mere hours after the ceremony indicates a profound psychological distress. Given her history of severe trauma from the scaffolding accident years ago, I fear the pressure of executive leadership has finally fractured her judgment." The boardroom shifted uncomfortably. He was weaponizing my personal trauma, using my staged marital collapse to paint me as an erratic, hysterical woman unfit for command. "I am proposing a formal resolution to temporarily relieve Lauren of her duties as chief architect," Gregory announced smoothly. "Additionally, for the safety of her younger sister, I am initiating a comprehensive review of Mia's medical trust to ensure the frozen funds do not disrupt her critical care." He was not just trying to steal my company, he was threatening to strangle my sister's lifeline. He wanted absolute dominion over every financial artery in the Sterling Empire. If you've ever had to smile through gritted teeth while someone tried to steal what's yours, let me know you're still with me. I sat at the opposite end of the long table. I did not interrupt him. I did not shout in defense of my sanity. I simply observed him with the clinical detachment of an engineer inspecting a rotting beam. Logan's forensic files would take months to process through a federal grand jury, which was far too slow to stop today's vote. I needed a tactical weapon, an absolute failsafe that could obliterate Gregory's narrative instantly. The board voted tomorrow morning. I watched the shareholders exchange uneasy glances, silently weighing Gregory's manufactured concern against my proven track record. They were businessmen, driven by stability and profit margins. Gregory was offering them a scapegoat for the frozen capital, a convenient narrative that protected their dividends. I knew that logic alone would not sway them today. I needed something tangible, something that bypassed corporate bureaucracy entirely. I stood up slowly, smoothing the jacket of my tailored suit. "The board may vote tomorrow." I addressed the room, my voice perfectly level. "Until then, my executive authority remains intact." I turned and walked out of the glass doors. The board voted tomorrow morning. "Chuong moi bon train, he moi bay much tio namtram, nam moi janviet, namtram chin moi sao tu. Quong moi lam trui tim toa joku." I drove through the heavy Chicago rain, my mind filtering through the immediate tactical realities. Logan's forensic accounting files proving Gregory's embezzlement were incredibly thorough, but corporate litigation was a notoriously slow mechanism. Gregory would undoubtedly tie the audit up in endless discovery motions and legal injunctions. By the time a federal judge looked at the spreadsheets, Gregory would have successfully frozen Mia's medical trust and finalized his hostile takeover of the board. I needed a weapon that required zero deliberation. I needed a mechanism of absolute, immediate authority. The memory from the cafe, The image of my father pointing to the specific blueprint of the old family estate pulsed repeatedly in my consciousness. Architects always leave a hidden space for the truth. Lauren. My father was a man of extraordinary foresight. He had known about Gregory's underlying greed long before his own death. He would not have left Mia and me entirely defenseless. He must have built a fail-safe. The tires of my town car crushed the gravel of the winding driveway leading to the historic Sterling country estate. The massive stone mansion had been practically abandoned since his passing, maintained only by a skeleton crew of caretakers. The rain lashed against the dark, Gothic windows as I unlocked the heavy oak front doors. The air inside smelled of polished wood, old paper, and preserved silence. I bypassed the grand staircase and walked directly into the cavernous East Library. The room was perfectly symmetrical, lined with towering bookshelves containing thousands of architectural histories. I pulled up the mental image of the blueprint my father had shown me. I walked to the far corner of the room, standing before the third pillar on the northern wall. To the untrained eye, it was a beautifully carved mahogany column supporting the vaulted ceiling. To an architect, it was an anomaly. The circumference was fractionally wider than its load-bearing counterparts, a spatial discrepancy of merely 2 inches. I ran my hands along the intricate floral carvings, my fingertips searching for the mechanical release. I found a slight depression hidden within a wooden rosette. I pressed firmly. A soft mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. A vertical panel of the mahogany pillar smoothly disengaged and popped open, revealing a hidden cavity lined with dark steel. My heart beat with a steady, calculated rhythm. Inside the narrow vault sat a heavy, fireproof document box. I pulled it out, feeling the substantial weight of its contents. I placed it on the large reading table in the center of the library, the only sound the relentless rain striking the glass outside. I unlatched the heavy metal clasps, the hinges groaning slightly from years of disuse. I carefully opened the heavy lid of the fireproof box. The interior was remarkably well preserved, untouched by the dampness of the old estate. Stacks of meticulously organized files rested inside, bound in thick, archival folders. At the very top lay a sealed envelope bearing my father's distinct, angular handwriting. It was simply addressed to me. As I broke the wax seal, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. The anxiety of the impending board vote dissolved, replaced by the cold, comforting logic of a perfectly executed structural design. My father had indeed calculated every variable. I broke the plaster wall. I sat in the dim light of the estate library, the heavy fireproof box resting on the mahogany table. The letter from my father lay open in my hands. The paper was slightly yellowed, a quiet testament to the passage of time. He had written it almost a decade ago, shortly after my scaffolding accident, when his own health had begun to rapidly decline. He did not write about regret or sorrow. He wrote about structural integrity. Lauren, the letter began, his handwriting sharp and precise. If you are reading this, the structural flaws I suspected in Gregory have resulted in a critical failure. I have spent the last 6 months analyzing his project expenditures. The numbers do not align with reality. He is diverting capital. I cannot prove the scaffolding collapse was his doing without exposing the entire Sterling Empire to a federal scandal while you are still recovering in a hospital bed. You are too vulnerable right now. So, I am leaving you a foundation he cannot touch. I read the words again. He knew. He had seen the microscopic fractures in Gregory's facade long before anyone else. He had understood that my accident was not an act of nature, but a calculated removal of an obstacle. He chose to remain silent in his final days, not out of cowardice, but out of a profound need to protect me while I was physically broken. He traded his immediate vengeance for my long-term survival. Beneath the letter lay a thick stack of legal documents and a small, encrypted solid-state drive. The documents were bound in heavy black leather. I carefully lifted the binder, feeling the literal weight of my father's final strategic maneuver. He had not left me a weapon of brute force. He had left me a mechanism of absolute, irrefutable law. I thought about the years I had spent believing I was alone. I thought about the endless society galas where I stood silently, bearing the weight of Gregory's manufactured pity. I had built my own architectural firm from the ground up to prove my independence. Yet, sitting here in the quiet library, I realized my father had been standing guard this entire time, waiting patiently in the shadows of the past for me to find the key. The documents outlined a corporate structure so complex and perfectly insulated that it commanded absolute respect. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering. Gregory had spent 9 years thinking he was the master architect of my life. He had systematically isolated me, controlled Mia's medical narrative, and attempted to steal a multi-billion-dollar merger to cover his own theft. He thought he had outsmarted us all. He had deeply miscalculated. My father had drawn the ultimate blueprint, and I was finally ready to build it. I placed the letter carefully back into the steel box. I did not shed a single tear of grief. I felt only a profound, crystalline clarity. The fear that had hovered over me regarding Mia's medical fund completely evaporated. I held the ultimate shield. I spread the contents of the black leather binder across the reading table. As I read through the dense legal clauses, the brilliance of my father's strategy became utterly clear. This was not a standard will or a typical financial holding. It was an irrevocable contingency trust. In the realm of wealth management, an irrevocable trust is the equivalent of a titanium bunker. Once the assets are transferred into it, the grantor completely relinquishes ownership. The assets belong solely to the trust itself. Consequently, they are entirely shielded from creditors, legal judgments, and, most importantly, hostile family members. Gregory could waive endless medical proxies and board resolutions, but he could never penetrate this structure. It was legally impenetrable. My father had quietly transferred the majority of the Sterling family's voting shares and a massive reserve of liquid capital into this trust just weeks before his death, but he had engineered a specific trigger clause. The trust remained completely dormant, a ghost in the financial system, until a specific condition was met. That condition was any documented attempt by a secondary family member to unilaterally seize control of Mia's medical fund. Gregory's motion to the board yesterday to review Mia's trust had officially tripped the wire. I reviewed the activation protocols. It did not require a judge's ruling. It did not require a board majority. It required only my signature and the original notarized seal, which sat perfectly preserved at the bottom of the box. By signing this document, I would instantly awaken the trust. It would immediately absorb the voting rights Gregory thought he controlled, effectively stripping him of his executive power in a matter of seconds. It was a flawless mechanism of corporate justice. Beside the trust documents lay the encrypted hard drive. My father had attached a small index card with a sequence of numbers. I recognized the sequence instantly. It was the exact mathematical ratio of the Civic Center's central dome, my very first independent project. I plugged the drive into my laptop and entered the ratio. The screen illuminated with hundreds of spreadsheets. This was the forensic data. My father had meticulously tracked the initial flow of diverted funds. It showed the exact dates Gregory had funneled money from the company's safety maintenance budget into the offshore shell accounts Grace was now tracking. It proved, mathematically, that Gregory had defunded the safety protocols on the exact scaffolding rig that had collapsed on me. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for emotional manipulation or gaslighting. It was pure, unadulterated data. Gregory had traded my physical safety for offshore capital. He had traded my ability to have a family for a larger profit margin. The spreadsheets laid out his entire betrayal in neat, black and white columns. I closed the laptop. The anger inside me was entirely analytical. I possessed the absolute truth. The math was completely flawless. Dawn broke over Chicago, casting a sharp, metallic light across the city skyline. I had driven back from the estate and immediately convened a secure meeting at my private architectural firm. The office was quiet, the drafting tables empty. Only 3 people sat in the main conference room: Logan, Grace, and myself. I placed the original, notarized, irrevocable trust documents on the glass table. Next to it, I set the encrypted hard drive containing my father's forensic data. Logan opened his laptop, connected the drive, and began cross-referencing my father's historical spreadsheets with the current data Grace had extracted from Cameron's internal systems. The room was silent, save for the rapid clicking of Logan's keyboard. Grace sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked terrified but deeply resolute. She was finally looking at the mechanism that would avenge her mother's financial ruin. "It is a perfect match," Logan said, his voice dropping an octave. He turned the laptop screen toward us. "Your father tracked the outgoing diversions 9 years ago. Grace's data tracks the incoming deposits to the shell companies operating today. The tax identification numbers align perfectly. Gregory has been running a continuous, systemic embezzlement operation for nearly a decade." I nodded slowly, my gaze fixed on the screen. "And the trust?" I asked, pointing to the leather binder. Logan carefully reviewed the activation clauses of the Irrevocable Contingency Trust. He was a master of corporate acquisitions, and even he looked impressed. "It is bulletproof. Lauren, the moment you present this to the board and officially execute your signature, Gregory's voting shares are instantly absorbed by the trust. He loses his majority standing immediately. He will be completely paralyzed." "He will fight," Grace whispered. "He will use the board to stall." "He cannot stall a federal indictment," Logan replied smoothly. "While you are at the board meeting, my legal team will hand-deliver copies of this entire forensic audit to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. By the time Gregory realizes he has lost the company, the federal agents will already be in the lobby." I looked at the documents, the drive, and the 2 people sitting across from me. We had assembled an absolute financial guillotine. Gregory had built his power on the assumption that I would always prioritize quiet compliance over public scandal. He relied on the illusion of my fragility. Today, I was going to dismantle his entire reality. "We are about to walk into the fire. If you're ready to see a kingdom fall, type 'ready'." I picked up my customized drafting pen and signed my name on the activation line of the trust. My signature was precise, sharp, and entirely unwavering. I placed the document into a leather portfolio. I stood up and smoothed my jacket. The time for quiet endurance had officially expired. The trap was fully set. Friday morning arrived with a heavy, overcast sky. The Sterling corporate headquarters stood in the center of the financial district, a monument to decades of calculated wealth. I walked through the main lobby, the heels of my shoes clicking against the polished granite. I did not look at the security guards or the receptionists. My focus was entirely singular. Grace walked slightly behind my right shoulder, carrying a heavy stack of identical black folders. Logan flanked my left, his presence a quiet, imposing warning. We took the private elevator to the 58th floor. The doors slid open to reveal a hushed corridor leading to the primary boardroom. I could feel the collective tension of the executives waiting inside. Gregory had spent the last 48 hours actively lobbying the shareholders, painting the picture of a traumatized, irrational heiress who was actively sabotaging the company's future by freezing the $2.5 billion escrow account. I reached the heavy glass doors of the boardroom and pushed them open without knocking. The room was vast, dominated by a long table carved from a single piece of rare walnut. 20 of our most influential shareholders sat in high-backed leather chairs. At the head of the table sat Gregory. He looked impeccably groomed, projecting an aura of deeply burdened authority. He was holding a gavel, preparing to call the meeting to order. When I walked in, the low murmur of conversation instantly died. Gregory's eyes flickered toward me, then shifted to Logan and Grace. A brief shadow of confusion crossed his face before he quickly reassembled his paternal mask. "Lauren," Gregory said, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. "I am surprised you decided to attend, given the immense emotional strain you have been under regarding Cameron. The board was fully prepared to proceed with the administrative transitions in your absence." I did not respond to his bait. I walked past the row of silent executives and stopped at the opposite end of the long table, directly facing him. The distance between us felt incredibly vast, a physical representation of the war we were about to fight. I did not sit down. I maintained a perfectly straight posture, resting my hands lightly on the polished wood. "I would not miss this meeting for the world, Gregory," I replied, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I understand there is a motion on the table regarding my executive competency and the management of Mia's medical trust." Gregory sighed, a masterful performance of familial sorrow. "It is a protective measure, Lauren, for the stability of the firm and the safety of your sister. The frozen capital is a massive liability." I looked at the shareholders. They were watching me closely, expecting a breakdown. They expected me to defend my marriage or scream about my rights. I did neither. I simply nodded to Grace. She stepped forward and began placing a black folder in front of every single board member. I took my rightful seat. The board members looked down at the black folders placed before them. They hesitated, waiting for Gregory's cue. But curiosity ultimately overrode their corporate loyalty. One by one, they flipped open the covers. The silence in the room shifted from expectant tension to a heavy, suffocating shock. "What you are looking at is a comprehensive forensic audit of the Sterling corporate accounts," I stated. My voice was entirely even, devoid of any theatrical anger. I spoke with the precise cadence of an architect presenting a structural analysis. "You will notice the initial spreadsheets date back 9 years, meticulously tracking the outgoing expenditures for our high-rise safety maintenance budgets." I watched as the executives traced the lines of data. I did not look at Gregory. I kept my attention focused entirely on the board. "If you turn to page 4, I continued, "you will see the corresponding incoming deposits. These deposits flow directly into an offshore network of shell companies. Those companies are registered under fraudulent subcontractor licenses. The tax identification numbers match perfectly. The capital never purchased safety equipment. The capital was systematically diverted." A low murmur rippled through the room. The senior partner to my left pushed his glasses up, his face turning entirely pale. "This is an absolute fabrication," Gregory said. His voice was louder now, the paternal warmth completely stripped away. He stood up, leaning aggressively over the table. "This is exactly what I warned you about. Lauren is acting under extreme psychological duress. She has frozen our capital and is now presenting forged documents to destabilize this board. This is a paranoid delusion." I did not raise my voice to compete with his. I waited exactly 3 seconds for his echo to fade. The data on page 4 was independently extracted from the offshore servers exactly 12 hours ago, I said calmly. I gestured toward Grace. It was cross-referenced by our internal audit team. More importantly, the foundational data from 9 years ago was not compiled by me. Gregory sneered, attempting to reassert control. Then who compiled this supposed evidence? My father, I replied. The two words dropped like anvils onto the mahogany table. Gregory froze. The color drained from his face, leaving his complexion a sallow, ashen gray. He suspected the financial diversions shortly after my scaffolding accident. I explained to the silent room. He tracked the defunding of the safety protocols. He tracked the money you stole. Gregory. The money that directly caused the structural failure that nearly killed me. The executives stopped looking at the folders. They all looked at Gregory. The dynamic in the room had fundamentally altered. I was not presenting a personal grievance. I was presenting a calculated systemic theft that had endangered a family member and defrauded the corporation. I had laid out the mathematics of a profound betrayal. I watched Gregory's chest heave as he struggled to formulate a coherent defense. The silence was absolutely deafening. Gregory gripped the edge of the walnut table. His knuckles turned entirely white under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. The initial shock was wearing off, rapidly replaced by the desperate adrenaline of a cornered predator. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling the narrative, and he was not going to surrender his empire without deploying every weapon in his arsenal. This is an absolute farce, Gregory declared, his voice rising in volume. He looked around the room, attempting to lock eyes with the senior shareholders. Are you seriously going to entertain this? Lauren has brought a disgruntled intern and a rival corporate strategist into our secure boardroom to present fabricated spreadsheets. It is a pathetic attempt to distract you from the fact that she has illegally frozen our operational capital. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the encrypted drive sitting on the table. Digital files can be easily manipulated. Anyone with a basic understanding of accounting software could draft those numbers. My brother was a brilliant architect, but he was not an investigator. This is a forged document designed to frame me. I did not interrupt his performance. I let him expend his energy. When he finally paused to take a breath, I simply nodded to Grace. Grace did not flinch under the weight of the executive's stares. She stepped forward and connected a secondary tablet to the boardroom's primary projection system. The massive screen behind Gregory illuminated. It did not show spreadsheets. It displayed a highly complex series of digital server logs, complete with timestamps and heavily encrypted routing protocols. These are not simply internal spreadsheets, Grace explained, her voice steady and professional. These are the direct server access logs from the offshore holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands. They detail the exact IP addresses used to authorize the incoming wire transfers over the past 9 years. The originating IP address for every single fraudulent transfer traces directly back to the secure terminal located in Gregory Sterling's private office. The board members stared at the glowing screen. The technical evidence was absolute. It bypassed the realm of accusation and entered the realm of undeniable fact. Gregory opened his mouth, his face flushing a deep crimson. Those logs are inadmissible. You have no legal right to access my terminal data without a formal subpoena. Logan finally spoke. He leaned casually against the glass wall, crossing his arms. You are entirely correct, Gregory, Logan said, offering a shark-like smile. Grace does not have subpoena power. However, the federal agents at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division certainly do. My legal team handed them the complete, unredacted forensic file exactly 1 hour ago. They have already secured the warrants for the offshore servers. Gregory's mouth snapped shut. The realization of his impending legal reality washed over him like a physical blow. He looked at the projection screen, then at the silent, judging faces of the board members he had tried to manipulate. He had brought them here to witness my removal, but instead, he had provided the perfect audience for his own professional execution. The walls were closing in. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted entirely. The shareholders were no longer evaluating my competency, they were actively calculating their legal distance from Gregory. The man who had entered the room radiating absolute authority was now standing at the head of the table, visibly trembling. The arrogant facade had completely evaporated. Gregory looked at the frozen faces of his former allies, realizing that corporate loyalty is strictly bound to profit, not sentiment. When he found no support among the executives, he slowly turned his gaze back to me. The aggression vanished, instantly replaced by the sickeningly familiar mask of the benevolent, deeply wounded uncle. "Lauren, please," Gregory whispered. His voice was suddenly fragile, perfectly tuned to elicit pity. "We are family. Do not do this. Do you not remember who sat by your hospital bed for weeks? I paid every single medical bill. I ensured you had the best surgeons in Chicago. I kept this company afloat while you were broken. I sacrificed years of my life to protect you and Mia." I looked at him, feeling an icy calm settle deep in my chest. He was attempting to weaponize his benevolence one final time. He wanted me to balance the scales of justice with the currency of guilt. "You did pay the surgeons, Gregory," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the long walnut table. "You paid the men who told me I would never be able to carry a child. You paid the bills for the catastrophic internal injuries caused by a scaffolding collapse." I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. The tragedy was old. Only the truth remained. I spent 9 years believing my body was broken by a tragic accident. I continued, my gaze locked entirely on his terrified eyes. "But the spreadsheets prove that you defunded the safety protocols on that exact rig to pad your offshore accounts. You literally dismantled the steel above my head to line your pockets. You did not protect me, Gregory. You orchestrated my ruin, and then you bought my gratitude with stolen money." He backed away slightly, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. "It was a mistake," he stammered, the lie crumbling on his lips. "It was never meant to happen that way." "But it did," I replied coldly. "You stole my inheritance, you jeopardized my sister's medical care, and you took a piece of my future that I can never rebuild. Your financial protection was nothing more than a hostage situation. You thought I would remain quiet forever because I was grateful to be alive." I looked down at the black forensic folders resting on the table. The absolute certainty of the mathematics grounded me. "Your sacrifices were an illusion," I said, delivering the final verdict. "And your protection was a calculated cage. Today, the lease on that cage is permanently terminated. You hold absolutely no leverage over me anymore." The debt was paid in full. The silence following my declaration was absolute. Gregory stood frozen, his legal and moral defenses completely decimated. For a brief second, I thought the war was officially concluded. But men like Gregory do not surrender. They simply look for a lower and more treacherous angle of attack. The heavy boardroom doors swung open again. Gregory's personal attorney, a man known for utilizing the most aggressive legal loopholes in Chicago, walked briskly into the room. He did not look at the forensic folders. He walked directly to the center of the table and placed a sealed, highly official-looking document in front of the senior board member. Gregory's posture instantly straightened. A desperate, malicious smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He had deployed his final countermeasure. "The forensic audit is a matter for the courts," the attorney announced loudly, commanding the room's attention. "However, The immediate leadership of this corporation is a matter of administrative law. I have here a federally recognized medical petition for a conservatorship, signed by two independent psychiatrists. A collective gasp echoed around the table. Logan stiffened beside me. This petition, the attorney continued, his voice dripping with false concern, legally declares Lauren Sterling psychologically unfit to manage complex financial assets, citing severe post-traumatic stress and recent severe marital trauma. Under the bylaws of the state, this instantly suspends her executive voting rights and her control over the $2.5 billion escrow account. Gregory Sterling, as her closest living relative, is legally appointed as her temporary financial guardian, effective immediately. Gregory looked directly at me. He believed he had won. He had weaponized the legal system to bypass my evidence, utilizing a psychiatric loophole to strip me of my agency. He expected me to panic, to scream about my sanity, to validate the exact narrative of hysteria he had just submitted to the court. I did not panic. I had anticipated a legal ambush. I looked at the attorney, then at Gregory, and offered a very soft, deeply pitying smile. I raised my hand and signaled toward the hallway. The door opened one final time. An elderly man carrying a leather briefcase walked in. He was the most senior, respected notary public in the financial district. I pulled my father's black leather binder from my bag and opened it. A conservatorship is a powerful tool, I said calmly, but it only applies to assets directly held in my name. I slid the irrevocable contingency trust documents across the table. 30 minutes ago, I legally activated this trust. It is an airtight, irrevocable entity containing the entirety of the Sterling voting shares and liquid capital. It cannot be altered by a medical proxy. It cannot be touched by a guardian. The assets no longer belong to me. They belong to the trust, of which I am the sole, unremovable executor. Gregory stared at the notary's fresh seal. The legal reality crashed down upon him. His conservatorship was absolutely useless against a fortified, preemptive legal structure. He had brought a paper sword to a titanium fortress. The illusion of power vanished. The boardroom dissolved into a chaotic symphony of overlapping voices. The senior executives were rapidly scanning the irrevocable trust documents, their corporate attorneys whispering frantically in their ears. It did not take them long to verify the absolute legality of my father's architectural masterpiece. The trust was perfectly executed. The voting shares were securely locked within its impenetrable walls. Gregory's temporary guardianship held jurisdiction over exactly nothing. Gregory's attorney stared at the notarized seal, his face completely pale. He quietly closed his briefcase and took a deliberate step away from his client. In the corporate world, there is no loyalty to a sunken ship. Gregory collapsed back into his leather chair. He did not yell. He did not offer another excuse. The sheer magnitude of his defeat had finally severed his connection to his arrogant reality. He looked at the polished walnut table, his hands trembling violently. The man who had meticulously controlled my environment for 9 years was now entirely powerless, paralyzed by the weight of ink and paper. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom opened, cutting through the noise. 3 men in dark suits wearing federal badges stepped into the room. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic shouts. The process of dismantling a white-collar criminal is remarkably quiet. Gregory Sterling, the lead agent said, his voice entirely bureaucratic. We have a federal warrant for your arrest regarding multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and the deliberate falsification of safety documentation. Gregory did not resist. He stood up slowly, seemingly aged 10 years in the span of 30 minutes. The federal agent gently pulled Gregory's arms behind his back. The sharp, Metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the silent boardroom was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was not the sound of vengeance. It was the precise sound of an equation balancing perfectly. As they escorted him toward the door, Gregory stopped and looked at me one final time. He searched my face, perhaps looking for a trace of the vulnerable, grieving girl he had manipulated in that hospital room nearly a decade ago. He found only the cold, unyielding gaze of the chief architect. I did not offer him a parting word. I simply watched him being led away into the corridor. The senior board member cleared his throat, adjusting his tie nervously. "Lauren," he began, his tone entirely deferential. "The board officially recognizes the authority of the trust. We will cooperate fully with the federal audit." I nodded slowly, picking up my father's leather binder. "Ensure the paperwork to unfreeze the $2.5 billion escrow account is finalized by noon," I instructed smoothly. "The capital will be diverted entirely toward the new Civic Medical Center project. The era of shadowy subcontractors is permanently closed." I turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving the executives to their frantic damage control. The heavy glass doors shut softly behind me. I stood in the quiet hallway, holding the documents that had saved my family. I finally owned my empire. I left the polished granite lobby of the Sterling corporate headquarters and stepped into the back of my waiting town car. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the Chicago streets slick and reflective under the breaking clouds. The battle for my empire was officially over, meticulously documented and legally secured within the impenetrable walls of the irrevocable trust. Gregory was currently sitting in a federal holding facility, stripped of his titles, his access, and his carefully constructed dignity. I had executed my father's final blueprint perfectly, but the victory felt surprisingly abstract. There was no time to celebrate corporate survival when an actual human life was hanging in the balance. I instructed my driver to head immediately to the University Medical Center. Cameron's highly invasive cardiovascular surgery had begun 2 hours ago. The drive felt infinitely longer than the confrontation in the boardroom. When I walked into the surgical waiting area, the stark contrast between the ruthless financial district and the fragile reality of the hospital was jarring. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic and stale coffee. Grace was already there, sitting rigidly in a vinyl chair, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked up as I approached, her eyes searching my face for any lingering animosity. She found none. I sat down next to her. We did not need to speak. We were no longer two women divided by a fabricated narrative of betrayal. We were simply two people waiting for a heart to continue beating. Logan arrived an hour later, carrying 3 cups of dark coffee. He handed one to me and one to Grace, offering a quiet, reassuring nod. He had secured the corporate perimeter, ensuring the transition of power at the firm remained entirely seamless while I was away. He understood his role perfectly. He was a brilliant strategist, but he also recognized that this specific battle was not about mergers or acquisitions. The hours crawled by with excruciating precision. Every time the heavy double doors of the surgical wing opened, the tension in the room spiked. I reviewed the architectural plans for the Civic Center on my tablet, forcing my mind to focus on structural logic rather than medical probabilities. Finally, the lead cardiothoracic surgeon walked through the doors, pulling off his surgical cap. He looked exhausted, but the rigid lines of his face were remarkably relaxed. He walked over to where Grace and I were sitting. He explained the complexities of the procedure, detailing the successful integration of the transplanted tissue and the stabilization of Cameron's cardiovascular rhythms. The critical danger had passed. Cameron was alive, resting in the intensive care unit. The recovery would be long and demanding, but the mathematical probability of survival had shifted drastically in our favor. Grace buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly with profound relief. I simply closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath. The meticulously calculated risks had finally yielded a positive return. I thanked the surgeon, my voice perfectly steady. I walked over to the observation window of the intensive care unit, looking at the man who had tried to play the ultimate villain to save my life. The monitor beeped steadily. 6 months later, the Chicago skyline looked entirely different to me. It was no longer a towering reminder of corporate warfare, but a canvas of genuine possibility. The transition of power within the Sterling Empire had been remarkably swift. Armed with the forensic audit and the power of the irrevocable trust, my legal team systematically dismantled Gregory's offshore network. He pleaded guilty to federal charges of wire fraud and embezzlement, accepting a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary to avoid a highly publicized trial. I did not attend his sentencing. I had already closed that chapter of my life in the boardroom. My primary focus shifted immediately to reconstruction. I successfully finalized the Gold Coast acquisition, merging the two adjacent lots independently without relying on the restrictive clauses of my initial marriage contract. The $2.5 billion capital injection, previously frozen in escrow, was now actively funding the largest architectural development in the city's history. But I did not stop at commercial real estate. I utilized a significant portion of my recovered inheritance to establish the Sterling Foundation for Workplace Safety. It was a comprehensive legal and financial trust designed specifically to protect victims of corporate negligence. The foundation provided independent medical auditing, ensuring that no executive could ever weaponize healthcare for corporate leverage. Families devastated by construction accidents, families who had been manipulated by men like Gregory, now had an impenetrable fortress of legal support. It was my way of ensuring that the structural failure I experienced 9 years ago would never quietly destroy another family. Mia was thriving, with her medical trust entirely under my direct control. I transferred her care to the most advanced immunological specialists in the country. The constant shadow of Gregory's financial threats was permanently erased from her life. Mia was no longer a pawn in a boardroom chess match. She was simply a teenager exploring her passion for watercolor painting. Touring art schools on the East Coast without the burden of our family's dark history. Logan remained an exceptional financial advisor. Our professional relationship was sharper and more lucrative than ever. He had recognized the absolute boundary I established in Cameron's office that day, and he respected it completely. We closed deals, analyzed market trends, and dominated the corporate landscape. But he never crossed the line into personal territory again. He was a brilliant ally, and sometimes, an ally is exactly what you need. Cameron's recovery was a grueling, meticulous process. The physical rehabilitation required patience, a virtue neither of us naturally possessed. But we approached his healing with the same rigorous dedication we applied to our corporate strategies. He officially stepped down as the chief executive officer of his firm, handing the reins to a trusted board of directors, and focused entirely on rebuilding his physical endurance. The man who had tried to orchestrate his own tragic exit was now learning how to live an unscripted life. We spent our evenings reviewing blueprints and reading case files, our shared ambition transforming into a quiet, profound partnership. The steel framework held. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, warm, geometric shadows across the imported Italian marble. It was exactly 1 year since my wedding night. I stood by the edge of the master bed, holding a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea. The atmosphere was completely unrecognizable from the sterile, calculated coldness of that initial evening. There were no frozen escrow accounts today. There were no rehearsed speeches about corporate alliances or staged affairs. There was only the quiet, undeniable reality of a foundation that had been tested and proven indestructible. Cameron walked into the room, holding a freshly printed architectural rendering. He was wearing a simple gray sweater, the fabric partially revealing the top of the long, faded surgical scar running down the center of his chest. It was a permanent physical reminder of the vulnerability he had tried so desperately to hide, and the battle we had ultimately won together. He did not look like a ruthless billionaire attempting to control my narrative. He looked like a partner. The structural engineers reviewed the load-bearing calculations for the new Civic Medical Center, Cameron said, handing me the document. His voice was steady, resonant with a quiet strength. Your numbers are completely flawless, Lauren. The Foundation can support the additional research wing without compromising the aesthetic integrity of the central dome. I took the blueprint, tracing the intricate lines with my fingertips. This building was the culmination of everything I had fought for. It was funded by the clean, legitimate capital of our combined empires, designed to house the very specialists who had saved Cameron's life and secured Mia's future. It was a structure built entirely on truth. Gregory had believed that power was derived from manipulation and the hoarding of capital. He had built a fragile empire on the suffering of his own blood. But true power is the ability to construct a reality where those you love are absolutely untouchable. I had used the very legal systems he tried to weaponize against me to ensure his permanent removal from our lives. We had navigated a labyrinth of deceit, dismantled a deeply entrenched financial criminal, and defied a catastrophic medical prognosis. We had achieved this not by surrendering to panic, but by relying on the absolute precision of facts, documents, and undeniable legal power. I took a sip of my tea, feeling a profound sense of equilibrium. The trauma of the past 9 years had finally been compartmentalized, filed away like an obsolete building code. I had learned the most valuable lesson of my career. Legacy isn't the money you inherit. It's the people you choose to protect with your power. I set the blueprint down on the desk, the paper resting perfectly flat against the smooth surface. The war was over. The accounts were secure, and the future was entirely my own to design. If this story reminded you of your own strength, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. The blueprint was flawless,